Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is December 28, and we're recording S4A live stream number 74. It's the end of the year, 2022, and COVID. We've talked about it a lot over the last 3 years. Basically, the end of last year saw S4A putting up a video titled "The Pandemic May Just Be Beginning." That was just a few days shy of an entire year ago. And I stand by that. So basically, over the last few months, I have had an entire window of my browser dedicated to collecting COVID articles that I really just partly didn't have the energy, but also just didn't have the time to completely go through. And what we're going to do now for live streams 74 and 75, which normally we stream on Wednesdays and Thursdays over on Twitch at twitch.tv/Socialism S4A, which we're doing right now. And we got 4 people joining us live there for chat and commentary. We're going to do that. And if we don't get through all these articles in 2 days, which we might well not do, then we're just going to keep going and do however many days it takes to do a year-end roundup of COVID-19 news. There's a lot of stuff that we can reinforce from earlier in the year, and there's a lot of topics that we haven't even been able to cover, or that, research has been emerging on, and, we want to highlight new developments in the research. So to give a quick overview, I want to say, first of all, that there are basically, here, let's get the appropriate screen going, first of all here, just to set the tone. There we go. Number one, there is no end in sight to the COVID-19 pandemic. That is point number one. Number two, COVID-19's effects are far worse than the average person currently understands. So we've gotten to a point where more people are surviving the acute phase of COVID, the first few weeks that would often kill people, land you in the hospital with a pneumonia-like condition, your lungs fill with fluid, and death can result from that. But there are many other more long-term, medium and long-term effects. There are many effects of long COVID that can start 2 or 3 months after your infection and then last for 8 to 12 months. And then there are some things that may never get better on their own, such as cognitive impairment. All right, so COVID-19's effects are far worse than the average person currently understands. So basically, the health risks of COVID are being dramatically underestimated right now. And we're going to go into a lot of supporting evidence for that point, all of the damage that COVID can do. We're going to have several sections on that. Point 3, the USA and most other countries are moving in exactly the wrong direction in their response to it. And this now includes China as of this month. China, for a while, even within, the S4A community, it's pretty much split down the middle as whether, China is, if not socialist now, heading in a more socialist direction over the long term, and they're allowing capitalism as part of a larger plan, versus no, China is, the other half says, China is headed directly away from socialism and has no real plan to return to it, despite some statements that they do. But basically the evidence would seem to suggest the contrary. China had been doing great on COVID prior to this. They are undoing their COVID response in a hurry, and it's probably going to make for an absolutely awful 2023 as far as the pandemic goes, which of course they will be blamed for, as they were blamed for all of COVID in the first place. Although we're going to be covering a story, and we've covered stories on COVID origins before, not specifically like, is it a bioweapon, whatever. At this point, to be honest, I don't care. What we need to do is stop it. After the pandemic has been stopped, we can, figure that out. Was it of natural origins or whatever? Right now we need to stop people from dying and getting injured. But origins, as far as, was the first outbreak really in China or was it in Southern Europe? We had read stories before about how there were wastewater levels of COVID detected in late 2019 in Spain and Italy There's another article about a case of a boy in Italy. I want to say in November, but late 2019. We'll be reading that. In other words, there's been complete double standards regarding China and most of the coverage of China's letting it rip, which is, to be clear, not a good move. Um, there, it's the height of hypocrisy, the pinnacle, where countries like the United States or Canada or the UK, countries that let it rip a year ago, are now harshly condemning China letting it rip. And it's just like pot meat kettle. It's the actual pinnacle of hypocrisy. But this is so typical on anything having to do with China. Whether they're socialist or not, whether they're moving towards socialism or not, just the hypocrisy on this is absolutely disgusting. So again, there's no end in sight to the pandemic. The effects of COVID are far worse than the average person understands right now, and the USA and most other countries are moving in exactly the wrong direction in their response to it. So we're going to do a number of things, and let me just give you an overview. First, I want to hit a story about Southwest Airlines is currently experiencing a huge amount of cancellations of flights in the US. Actually, we'll probably get to that one at the bottom of our opener section. So we're going to cover the wastewater data, some basics on masking and testing, and how to build a Corsi-Rosenthal box that is basically a fairly cheap but highly effective air filter for your house. Then we have a section on sort of an overview of what's been going on with individual control of COVID versus population health or public health control of COVID. And there's a number of articles here about how the CDC, for example, in the United States has just been laying down on the job. More and more U.S. life expectancy has been dropping. There are new COVID variants that are descendants of BA5, such as BQ1, currently running rampant in the UK right now. Report out of Canada about how COVID-19 hospitalizations due to Omicron are underreported. We're going to look at excess deaths and morbidity, that's sickness, from Australia. And that story touches on a note about the sort of pseudo distinction between deaths from COVID versus deaths with COVID. Long story short, the deaths from COVID and the deaths with COVID follow the exact same pattern. So as the next article, there's basically two together, says outright, there's no such thing as incidental COVID when it comes to death. The COVID is absolutely a causal triggering factor in the, quote, deaths with COVID and should not be treated as a separate category. I also want to talk about COVID and immune dysfunction. COVID is, as we will read in one of these articles that I was happy to see come out just this past week, COVID is the only virus other than HIV that attacks and kills T cells. There are some other viruses that can turn immune cells cancerous, but as far as just straight out murdering them, COVID and HIV, there it is. Now that said, COVID is not on the same level as HIV/AIDS as far as the destruction that it wreaks. It seems to be temporary, like in that 8 to 12 months range. That said, if people get COVID every 6 months, that could result in de facto ongoing T cell impairment. We've seen things like people having their T cell counts cut in half, and it's not a good thing. That is probably contributing to the rise of fungal infections and other, RSV, other viral infections and different things. Then we've got a section on vaccines and monoclonal antibodies and a couple of topics related to that. A lot of people have been hyping the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine. Well, the research is now in, and it's clear that the myocarditis risk is significantly higher after an actual viral infection with SARS coronavirus 2 versus the vaccine. So if you don't get vaccinated out of fear of myocarditis risk, which by the way is like single digits out of 100,000 cases, it's higher for certain demographics, like younger men are more likely to get it than not. But even then, it's a very small risk. But if you actually get the virus, your risk of myocarditis is much, much bigger than if you had just gotten the vaccine. So anyway, we're also going to compare. A lot of people are like, "Well, it's they just come up with more and more excuses. Well, it's the mRNA vaccines. They're more likely to cause the myocarditis." Well, actually, we can compare the observed effects of for example, Moderna and the myocarditis there versus, for example, Sinopharm, different vaccine, and they're comparable. So that's another bullshit talking point that you've probably heard people saying. Then we're going to do a section on masks. As far as how many aerosol particles get exhaled by a sick person. Do masks work? Yes, they work. Couple of random stories about masks that may actually have detectors of viral particles in the future that could connect to an app. That would be a very interesting thing to see, is the area that you're in overrun with virus or not. There's another app people are setting up. You may have seen there are some apps that run where people can use their phone, hit record, and it will log how much noise there is in there. So a lot of times if you go to restaurants, bars, clubs, they can be extremely noisy. In the old days, before sound systems and things like that, the reason that pubs are called pubs is it was short for public house. It was the place where everybody could congregate and have conversations. And yeah, it could get, noisy from the volume of people's voices. But it wasn't just like deafening TV and music going. So anyway, there are apps that can actually let you log basically the noise in different restaurants and clubs. So it's sort of like a, Yelp or like business reviews, but for noise, and it's measured by your phone. Anyway, somebody has started an app to do the same thing with CO2 logging. So carbon dioxide monitoring is basically a measure of like how fresh the air is in indoor settings. So there's something called the Raven app. Hopefully it still exists. Actually, I haven't looked at it, but it's from a couple months ago. There's an app to try to create a map of monitoring how much fresh air is in different places. So where are hotspots of dead air where virus is likely circulating that people really trying not to catch COVID should probably avoid. And then a couple articles on Paxlovid being underused. Ivermectin, just the conclusive evidence that it does not work. We have a study on that. People don't really even talk about that much anymore, but I mean, it may have been, in fact, partly due to the fact that studies have shown it did not work. A couple of things about the risk of reinfection and some specifics with that. Also, long COVID. This is kind of the meat of it. So several articles doing overviews. Somebody was asking before in the chat about hair loss and COVID. So that's right in the title of the first article we're going to look at. Persistent brain fog and hair loss highlighted in long COVID studies. Yes, that is a fairly common symptom of long COVID. When I had long COVID, wasn't really that much of a thing, but so it's not in everybody. But I've seen videos of people like young women, a group who naturally very unlikely to experience significant hair loss, getting like handfuls of hair falling out, like chemotherapy type hair loss. Also, brain shrinkage, overall profiles of long COVID symptoms according to different variants. So it seems like different variants have different symptom clusters. A couple of articles about neurological symptoms of long COVID, which is a major one. And then I feel like kidney damage doesn't often get talked about enough with COVID, but your kidneys are one of the major vital organs that does get directly infected by COVID. And an article there about symptomatic COVID-19 infection is associated with an increased risk of overactive bladder symptoms, which can create pretty significant problems, especially in a country. Well, I mean, even if you have easy access to a bathroom, that can significantly impair quality of life, but especially in a world where we've discussed in the past the lack of sort of public bathrooms, no accommodations, only spend money. What, you have to use the bathroom? Go home. It's just, the U.S. is not set up in a way that's very realistic as far as providing bathrooms to people. But yeah, overactive bladder plus trying to do errands in the U.S., not a fun combination. Anyway, long section after that on children. So everything from the number of children estimated to have been orphaned due to COVID-19 worldwide is huge. Overview of what COVID does to children. That children's risk of long COVID is comparable to that of adults. Piece about pediatric hepatitis in COVID. We've covered some of these topics before, including the pediatric hepatitis. We haven't covered all these specific articles. Article on kids and teens having long-term lung damage after COVID, stillbirths being associated with COVID, newborns testing negative for nasal swab. So in other words, they didn't get COVID, SARS coronavirus 2 in their nose, but a stool sample tested positive for COVID. So it appears that in the womb, children can get COVID from their mother, and then the baby's gut becomes a viral reservoir for COVID, and then they're born with SARS coronavirus 2 living in their gut, but it's not in their respiratory system. So yeah. Another article about children being, well, basically the whole forcing open of the schools and how people have been gaslit about that. I thought it was an interesting article. Then some international things. So there's a story out of WebMD. COVID-19 appeared in a boy in Italy in November 2019. We'll read that story. A piece out of Africa about how African morgue data reveals a more significant COVID-19 death toll than the official reporting. And then a section on China, where, again, overall, the reporting on China by the U.S. and related countries is just the height of hypocrisy. Things like China's COVID-19 surge might spawn a new coronavirus mutant. Well, in the last year, how many new mutations and variants has China spawned? None. They were mostly dealing with the original strain and Delta. All right. Meanwhile, the rest of the world generated like dozens and dozens of new variants. Where is the, hit pieces attacking the U.S. for that? So it's just massive, massive double standards. But yeah, some specifics on how China has stopped their quarantining program and things like that. Finally, to wrap up, a few things about the failures of the CDC again, the U.S. government's long-term response, and they're dealing with long COVID, and possibly some things that you can do if you do get COVID, there's not a lot of over-the-counter stuff you can do. I've read a few things that, people ask about things like zinc and vitamin D and things like that. I'll share the few things that I have and understand that these are backups. First of all, in N95 we trust. Everything after that is damage control, literally. So first of all, you mask, you wear an N95, or you get a P100, which is the gold standard, and those aren't that expensive. $30 to $50 basically, and you get gold standard protection against respiratory infections. That's the main thing, and avoiding crowds and stuff like that. If you do get COVID, you make sure that your booster shots are up to date, and you get Paxlovid if you can get it, and you get the monoclonal antibodies if that works, although, as we'll cover, the immune escape on some of these variants has gone beyond where a lot of the current monoclonal antibody treatments can even deal with them. They did just recently authorize a new monoclonal antibody that it seems to be more effective against the BA.5 family, but we're getting down to having to come out with new monoclonal antibodies at this point because a lot of the old ones just don't work. So things like vitamin C, melatonin, N-acetylcysteine that various people have kind of put across my desk. I'll share that stuff at the end. But again, the main thing is don't catch COVID in the first place. Get vaccinated. And if you do wind up getting it and you're vaccinated and all that, how can you sort of best take care of yourself? We'll look at a couple of ideas. All right, so that's the overview. And let me also just add that before we get into any of this, this will be a multi-day thing. I actually have like another 20 or 30 articles that I want to look through. So some of these sections may grow as we go, and also there might be new sections as we go if I see a new pattern in some of the articles. But yeah, this is basically like a catch up on the last 4 or 5 months. This was not a good year for the pandemic, and it really, really gives me pause as to what 2023 is going to be like. I think it's going to be fucking horrendous, honestly. They're talking about 1 million deaths likely in China in the next, like, couple of months. It's bad. So, before we begin any of that, just catching up with comments related to COVID. The BF7 variant is going to spread really crazy in the upcoming holidays. Yes, that is ripping through China right now. That is, again, a BA5 descendant. We've covered that in the past. And it's just, as far as the preparedness not being there, we could have been preparing for this because it's been known for months and months, but Capital decided to just let everybody get really sick instead. I know I missed a few COVID comments earlier. If I don't read yours now, I'm lower down into the chat. Just repeat your comment and I will get to it. I'm going to catch up with the chat again before getting into the beginning of the presentation. COVID is going to run out of letters and characters from all the writing systems on Earth the way it looks right now. Depressing indeed. In Mexico, they just signed into law giving 12 days off per year, and I know people who want COVID not to be counted toward those days should they be infected. In Mexico, you get the 12 days even in your first year, but yeah, COVID days shouldn't count towards that. Yeah, I was, people know who've been listening to this for a while, I was like thinking of doing a program, school program, this year, and due to the COVID policy, I decided not to do that. And it was exactly that. It was like, well, we've been in this pandemic, nothing's fundamentally changed, but now suddenly, if you get COVID, that's on you. Like, if you miss a test because of COVID, you just fucked, whatever. And I was like, you know what? Not going to spend all the money that I was going to do to put myself in harm's way. We'll see in another, few years on that. But anyway. Are we just all going to get COVID? It seems inevitable. I've managed to evade it thus far. Keep masking. And yeah, so the next comment, need mask discipline. Don't share unfiltered air with anyone who wouldn't care for you if you developed long COVID. And again, if you're really invested, go for a P100. They cost, like I said, between 30 and $50. And it is the gold standard in respiratory protection against, airborne diseases like COVID. No matter what China does, Western media finds a way to spin it as terrible. Literally when the U.S. is doing the same or worse. Yeah. Now they're like, COVID cases are climbing in China. They should do something. Yeah, so, prior to this, it was like, zero COVID is awful, China's so draconian. Then they change it to do literally what the Europe and the US are doing. And it's like, China's going to create killer variants that are going to... And it's just like, they can't win, so yeah. I mean, they can't win with the Western media, for sure. That's how a close relative died, COVID shutting down their kidneys. Yeah, I mean, if you get hospitalized, like if your COVID is bad enough that you get hospitalized, the odds of severe kidney damage are over 50% from the last thing I read, so yeah. All right, study there on... Yeah, the different vaccines may have slight differences in their risk of myocarditis. When you actually break down what that risk is, though, it is tiny. And again, it's much smaller than the risk of actually getting myocarditis from the virus. So, yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. If Moderna has two or threefold more odds for myocarditis than Pfizer, I think Moderna is a better vaccine than Pfizer by most other standards. So, Yeah, I mean, if you're in one of the highest risk groups like younger men, maybe that's something you would want to look at. For most people, it's not really going to factor into the risk very much. But again, we'll cover that. Any info on using UV to sterilize the COVID? Honestly, I don't know. I don't. That would be more of, I think, a large scale air filtration and sterilization thing, and I haven't seen as much material on that. All right, let us now get into the beginning. And it begins. So we'll go as far as we can with this today. We will pick it up tomorrow and we will go until it's done. And we're going to begin, as per usual, with BioBot. So this is wastewater monitoring for SARS coronavirus 2. This is one of the best measurements there is. This is the blue line, the greenish line, or aquamarine, or whatever, like greenish colored line. That's cases. And as you can tell, they stopped counting the cases in 2022. That's why they're so much lower than the other curve. You can see in previous years, 2020, 2021, the cases curve followed the wastewater curve much more closely. But then you throw rapid tests and Omicron into the mix, and they're just not really counting the cases because most of the rapid tests don't get counted, though you can go to websites like Make My Test Count and report your thing. But at this point, I think it's kind of a drop in the bucket. But you can look at wastewater, and that doesn't depend on anything, really political other than the decision to monitor the wastewater or not. Basically, somebody gets the virus, it replicates in their body, it comes out in their excretions, and it winds up in the wastewater, which is monitored. So we can see here that the overall curve, and let's read the top, data last updated December 27 from samples collected during last week, the week of December 19. So this does not yet include the post-Christmas numbers. All right, we're still waiting to see that. So as it is right now, we're basically back up to where that peak was in August. This whole year has just kind of been like a big plateau of one big rolling infection as people get reinfected and reinfected. And it just keeps spreading. It'll go up, it'll go down, it'll go up, it'll go down. It is not endemic yet and is constantly mutating. By the way, endemic does not mean harmless. It just means that the rate is not going up or down. This is a pandemic. It's spreading uncontrollably across the whole world. So that's where we're at. That has not changed. And anybody saying that we're not in the pandemic phase is just fucking lying to you. So mention that to them. So that's the overall U.S. numbers, and that's pretty accurate and pretty current. There's not a big lag on this, but it'll be interesting to see what it looks like next week after they get the post-Christmas numbers. Now, here's a breakdown of the overall pandemic by region. You can see the Northeast tends to lead during surges. Right now, the Northeast, which is that orange line, that is at the second highest level. Well, if you count the initial peak in the spring of 2020, it's lower than that. Otherwise, this year, it's the second highest level since last winter's peak. It's at a very high level. Basically, 1,000 viral particles is a lot, and it's around 1,800, like 1,800 right now. The other regions are lower. Let's do kind of a zoom in on that. Here's the 6 months. So you can see this is back to July. There's the Northeast compared to others. So yeah, it's at like, okay, 1,600. And the Southeast is climbing. That's everything Texas to Florida up to Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky. Then the Midwest, sort of upper middle of the country, is plateauing at around 1,000. And then the West is currently in decline at around 600 average, but that's after a recent spike about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So they go up, they go down. Right now, overall, there's a surge, and we're at the second or third highest level since the Omicron spike, which was a very, very high spike. Now, let's look at the variants. So you can see We started with some Delta still existing at the end of last year. This is on the left side, that pink, that was Delta. So Delta got overtaken by BA1, that was Omicron. So BA1 was dominant from January through like March. Then in late March into April, the purple comes in, that's BA2. And then you get BA2.12, which is a descendant of Omicron. That's that kind of light purple lavender color. Then BA4 is the blue, and then BA5 is that like teal color. And then the different shades of green are offshoots of BA5. So BF7, BQ1, which includes a few other things in there, those are offshoots of BA5. So the BQ1 now it's looking like it's going to be on track to, I think that just became dominant in the UK, like this last week. And in the US, it's on track to becoming the dominant thing. So you can see that every few months, I mean, overall, BA5 had the longest reign. Although even that BA5 consists of a few, it's like not just one strain, it's BA5 and a few substrains. But that had the longest reign, but even that was only like 6 months. And otherwise we're getting new variants like every 3 months there's like a new dominant variant basically. So this thing just keeps mutating and it becomes more contagious and it becomes more immune evasive pretty much with every new round of the virus. So let's see what else we've got here. Just as a quick reminder for people, we want to talk about masking. So before the holidays, I put up a thing about masking, and where is my... There it is. So I put this up, and I got an interesting series of comments on this one. But basically, this will show you the time required to reach an infectious dose of virus inhaled by a non-infected person. So you have a thing here, if the infected person is wearing either nothing, a cloth mask, surgical mask, a fit surgical mask. Fitted is where it is creating a better seal around the side. So for example, with the surgical mask, you can knot the ends. Just look up a video on how to do that. Now, it's always going to be better to wear an N95 or a P100, but if all you have is a surgical mask, learn how to knot the ends because it's going to help create a better seal around the sides of your face. And then better than that is an N95. Better than that is a fit-tested N95. In the comments on this community post, you can just look up N95 fit testing. It's basically just where there's a really secure seal around to where you use a fragrant chemical, and if you can't smell it, then you have a fit-tested mask and you have like a really, really firm seal. So I would say beyond this is P100, where really you should never get infected if you're wearing a P100, more or less. So, and then, same thing if the non-infected person is wearing that. So basically both people are wearing an N95, and especially a fit-tested N95. It's going to provide many, many, many more hours of protection against infection. So, I put this up before the holidays because it's a good thing for people to remember as they're preparing to engage in ill-advised, indoor gatherings with lots of people. So I got this stupid-ass comment. There is nothing communist about this. Now get ready for buzzword soup. All you do is promote big pharma oligarchy surplus value. What do you don't use terms you don't know what they mean, please. And crush the working class. You side with oligarchy against the working class. You are not... This is because I told people to mask if you're going to like a holiday party. You are not a real Marxist-Leninist. You are as fake as they get. Because of fakes like you, people confuse communism with bourgeois shit liberalism. You are the enemy of real communists. Again, no real evidence for these claims in here, but just somehow masking is promoting big pharma. And I'm unfollowing because of this. Yay. Good. Please go. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. I had enough of this shit. Instead of educating with Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao... Okay. Actually, look over the last 2 weeks of videos. I think you might be surprised. You do promotions to Fauci and the World Economic Forum. Okay, so as far as Fauci, I have only mentioned Anthony Fauci in a critical light for declaring this April that we were, quote, out of the pandemic phase. This was a complete naked lie. As far as the World Economic Forum, I don't even think I've mentioned them. But, this is what happens when you get your talking points off of like Tucker Carlson's Nazi news show. Stop doing that. Sell out. Counter-revolutionary loser. No more. Unfollowed. Well, you couldn't have been following very closely if this is the kind of understanding that you have of these kinds of things. I think that there was a follow-up comment, and Klaus Schwab said, who I understand is part of the World Economic Forum. I don't follow this kind of stuff, but said at the beginning of the COVID campaign that masks are an essential part of the New World Order. I mean, this is a right-winger. What are you even talking about? Also, can we just think about this sentence for a minute? Masks are an essential part of the New World Order. What is so fucking sinister about wearing a mask when there is a high risk of airborne disease? Can you explain to me how this is a, quote, essential part of the New World Order? What is the New World Order? It's an amorphous, right-wing, anti-communist term. Your head is so far up your ass, it's sad. What we think about the effectiveness of masks or vaccines is a purely scientific issue. Okay, there's the first statement I agree with. And science says they both work well. And we also need to stop COVID from spreading because that's what's causing it to mutate, and we're never going to be able to control it just through vaccines alone. Calling me right-wing because... So they're trying to say there's no basis for masks, etc. Also, yes, masks are sold by capitalists, therefore you shouldn't use them. Well, I have bad news for you about food. You're going to have to stop buying and eating food as well because capitalists also, I believe, sell food. So, anyway, I have to share you, the audience, I have to let you in on this pain that I experience from time to time running this channel. I will say, I think most of these people have moved on by now, but I still get, some once in a while. Also, just to review this graphic, there's a link in the community post to the source. But basically, this is rapid tests. First of all, rapid tests are horrible in terms of their accuracy, very high false negative rate, and just they're not good as far as accuracy. PCR tests are much better, but you might not be able to get a PCR test. Anyway, down the left side, you can see the number of days into the infection. So the infectiousness, that peaks basically between days 2 and 10. It's over 50%, capable of causing an infection. But as far as the symptom onset, that's going to be days 2 to 4, where it's over 50%. So basically days 2 to 4 or 2 to 5, that's where you're having symptoms, but you're infectious long after that. You're infectious for like twice as long as that. So after you get infected, you're probably going to get symptoms on day 2. That's also when most of your infectiousness starts, but your symptoms are going to subside by like day 4 or 5 in most cases. But you're going to stay infectious for another 4 or 5 days, and you need to be aware of that. I mean, really even longer than that potentially. But for at least another 4 or 5 days, there's significant chance. You can see right there, days 7, 8, and 9, 96, 80, 65. So this is bad. A lot of people think, oh, my symptoms have subsided. I don't need to wear a mask anymore. If you had symptoms a couple days ago and you're thinking about going out in public, first of all, don't. Second of all, if you do for some emergency reason, wear at least an N95, if not a P100, or you will be spreading this virus to other people, period. Do not catch COVID and do not spread COVID. And if you have roommates, you have to mask indoors. Like, this is the horrible situation we're in, but you can't just pretend your way out of it, which is what the US and most other countries are trying to do. All right, finally, the rapid antigen test sensitivity. Where does the test actually work? Days 5 through 11. So really, like, after your symptoms have stopped. Most people are going to be testing when they have symptoms, days 2 through 4, and they're going to get a negative, but they may actually have COVID, and the test just wouldn't pick it up until days 5 through 10. So you got to be aware of that. Yeah. So anyway, just a little bit of a public service announcement there on using the test. This is important to know. Finally, let's take a look on the sort of prevention and taking care of yourself with environmental measures part. This was put together. I want to give this guy credit. There's a 15-year-old on Twitter named Shivan Taneja, and I'll give a link to this in the video description. How to build a Corsi-Rosenthal box. This is an infographic that they put together. What is a Corsi-Rosenthal box? It's an affordable DIY air cleaning system made with simple materials found in hardware stores. The box pulls air through the filters on the sides and blows out clean air. It is proven to reduce indoor exposure to airborne particles, including those containing the virus that causes COVID-19. The box can also decrease the levels of other particles in the air, such as dust or wildfire smoke. So it's going to filter viruses, but it's also going to filter any other random shit that's going to be in the air. So you can see there, obviously, you can either use the link or just take a screenshot. And you basically get a bunch of, or you get a box fan and then a bunch of air filters. And they mention specific types that you should use. So 3M 1900 MPR, or, well, actually, those are the ones that they recommend. If you dig into, or MERV 13. So the MERV is like a efficiency rating. So you want to get one that actually has good filtration. That's important. If you dig into this, you can find other recommended filters. But basically, as you can see, you use duct tape and a box fan, and you make a cube out of these filters taped together with the duct tape to make a strong seal so that air can't get around the filter. You want the air to go through the filter, not around it. And then you put some cardboard on top. You put the box fan there, and you make a circle in the box fan. That's just an aerodynamics thing to make the airflow optimal. You can run it without that circle on the fan, but it's not going to be as efficient for sort of complicated physics reasons. I saw somebody explaining this once. Anyway, bottom line, just make the circle. It'll make your filter work better. And so that will suck air through the filters, and it will result in very effective filtered air. Now, the thing is that you want to make sure then not to touch it without wearing, some kind of gloves or something like that, because it's going to be collecting the particles. So, yeah. Anyway, some good information to have, and it it works for viruses like COVID-19, but it's going to work for smoke or dust or pollen or any other kind of stuff like that. All right, so this concludes kind of our first section here. Let me just switch out to the chat for a minute, just see if there's any comments, and then we'll go on to the next section, which may actually be the last section for this first stream. But let's go into the chat and see what we've got. The MD stream homozygote told me that when I rapid test, I should swab my throat and then my nose. Yes, I have seen a little bit of pushback on this. So what you don't want to do if you swab your throat is don't recently have had anything acidic to drink. So this would include like coffee, soda, orange juice, etc. Because apparently acids can cause a false positive. All right. Also, when you swab the throat, you want to go fairly high up in the throat. The idea, I think, is to hit the pharynx. So that is, your larynx is lower in your throat. Your pharynx is the part of your throat that basically runs between your mouth and your sinuses. So it's like the upper part there. Lower sinus, upper throat, but it's that back passageway. I've seen a lot of that too. Actually, here, I think I have a visual on that. So let's see, what do we have for swabbing? And I've seen like slightly conflicting things here. So the oropharyngeal, basically they were saying you want to do number 2 and number 4. So the PCR test is going to want one thing, and the rapid test is going to want another thing. Basically, for the rapid test, swab your throat. They're saying number 2, the oral pharyngeal. So oral is mouth. Through your mouth, you want to swab your pharynx. So that's hitting your throat through your mouth. And then number 4, nasal swab. So do the throat first, then the nose. And you want to get deep in your nose, not just your outer nostril, but it should be uncomfortable. And they say swab is left in place for 10 or 15 seconds for secretion absorption and used to repeat the process in the other nostril. So yeah, this is, like I said, I've seen a little bit of pushback on this, saying that, the pH of the throat is different and it can cause a false positive. I don't know. I would, let's put it this way. I recently did do rapid testing and I swabbed my throat, and I did this a couple of times. I did not get any false positives off of that. So yeah, I think that there was another graphic here that somebody had shared. Oh, just that this was the difference. They, it came up negative, then they swabbed their throat, cheeks, and nose, and it came up positive. So is that a false positive? I've seen literally only one article suggesting that the throat swabbing could cause that. So here's another one. Do swab your nose with the same stick after. Do only if you have extra test kits on hand. Do only if you have predominantly throat symptoms. Don't do if you have had throat surgery recently. So you can see they're swabbing sort of the upper part. The little dangly thing is called a uvula. You want to swab sort of in that area. Behind the arch, circled in green, is the throat. It needs to go all the way to the back behind the big arch in the back of your mouth. And they say don't swab your tongue, cheek, or top of mouth. I've heard people saying to swab the cheek. And then with the same stick, do a normal nose swab on both nostrils. Per the other thing, leave it in your nostrils for 10 to 15 seconds. This is from Asia 1. So, anyway, that's some information. I'm still trying to get, definitive statements about this topic. And it's hard. Like, we're definitely on our own at this point. China's COVID response gave me hope for climate change, seeing a whole society change its ways. Yeah, I mean, until they don't, I guess. A lot of people getting deleted here. I'm not sure what's going on. I've noticed that people seem to be getting reinfected faster now. I wonder how short of an interval it is before you can be reinfected. I've seen 2 or 3 weeks. So yeah, that's other people are saying the same in the chat. 2 or 3 weeks. That's how long it takes to get reinfected. In the first year, it seemed like people were good for months after getting infected, the quote natural immunity. Oh, that was that commenter that I had on the screen. They were talking about natural immunity. Natural immunity doesn't exist. Okay, it might slightly take the edge off. It is not going to prevent reinfection. People are getting reinfected within the same month by the same strain. Yeah, or people are getting infected by multiple strains at the same time. I am crushing the working class by promoting surplus value. I think that unfortunate individual really had no idea what they're talking about. Yeah, I think that was their brain on MAGA communism, to be honest. Yeah, the face diapers, all of it. They had all the right wing talking points. I visited the Vosh subreddit once, and it was that kind of mishmash of confusion, whiplash, dissonance, hurt my brain. Yeah, well, that's what you get when your politics are just basically standard Democrat stuff, which is like that's the Vosh world is just the Democratic Party. There's no consistency to it at all. I don't understand why they stopped making COVID tests free. If they already had it free, why even change that? Well, I think that the official story, which is somewhat reasonable, is they were afraid. So the USPS, U.S. Postal Service, was basically facilitating, as part of the COVID response. There's a website, it's covidtests.gov, and it's back up now. So if you want free tests, go there. Just look up free COVID test USPS, or I'm pretty sure that it's covidtests.gov is the direct address. Um, yeah, what was I saying? So this is what happens when we're streaming for this for this long. I get tired by the end. But they stopped the program back in August, even though we were having like a massive COVID surge at that point, saying that they were fearing if they kept giving them out for free, that there would be a shortage in the winter when there would almost undoubtedly be a really big spike. That's somewhat reasonable, although you could just make more fucking tests. But anyway, they didn't. So they stopped the program for like 4 months. It's back up now, and you can get free tests again, but not very many of them. So yeah. That graphic entirely disproves the CDC's back to work 5 days after symptoms start. You are correct. You are correct, measuring spoon. You are very correct. So it is clear social murder. They are injuring and killing people with erroneous policy, which exists solely to create, well, to, if you will, crush the working class by creating, having the working class create surplus value to be extracted. We still have to fix the trolls' comments because they didn't even make sense grammatically, like with what the concept means. But yeah, no, that's the actual crushing of the working class, is knowingly sending you in to get sick during a pandemic of a disease that directly infects immune cells and kills them. I wear an elastomeric P100. Now, don't you notice, for me, it's like breathing maskless compared to a disposable mask. So I have tried the P100, and I have to say, if you get the right kind, there are kinds that they have two holes that are as big as a quarter. I can breathe better in a P100 than I can in an N95. So it's bigger, it's bulkier, but it doesn't matter. If I wear a P100, I know that my odds of actually getting COVID are like zero. So the peace of mind benefit is enormous. Also, I literally can breathe better in it. The only downside is condensation. It gets kind of wet in there, but because it doesn't release any like water vapor. But that can happen with an N95 too. But no, I mean, the one that I tried, it had two breathing holes as big as a quarter. So that's, for me, better than an N95. Yeah, so the current standard is a 5-day quarantine, don't even need a negative result, and it's not enforced in any way because colleges and workplaces and schools and all other institutions, I mean, with very few exceptions, like movie sets and like, I think when they film, TV shows and stuff, they're still doing mandatory weekly testing. But otherwise, in most other institutional settings, there's no, weekly or twice weekly testing or anything like that. So, you could have COVID and go, and there's no repercussions for that. Nobody's going to be checking. It is outrageous and dangerous, yeah. Corsi cubes are about 50% of the cost of comparable pre-made air filters like the Levolt Core series. Yes, they're a cheap DIY solution to air filtration. I mean, even if you have allergies or something, or you live in an area with wildfires, or you have pets, or like whatever, yeah, you can buy air filters. Like years ago, I had like a Honeywell air filter. There was some concerns about mold and stuff like that. So yeah, I think I spent like $100 and I got like this air filter. It was big, it was noisy, and yeah, making a cube like that much cheaper. Like box fans are not real expensive, and then you just have to pay for the filters and duct tape. So I feel like you could easily add a UV light into that box to add an extra layer of filtration and disinfection. Yeah, I don't know what intensity of UV light is actually required for that to be effective. Let me just make a note of that in case I come across anything. UV light intensity needed. I just don't know, so that's outside of my body of knowledge. Yeah, they say to wait 30 minutes after eating or drinking to swab throat. So yeah, eat something, drink some water, and then like wait a while. So there you go. I did 2 tests, both were negative. I went to the doctor, they said it was just the common cold, thankfully. That's good. I mean, COVID is so much more than the flu or anything like that. Here in Germany, all of the measures will be canceled. According to a virologist, Christian Drotzen, mass immunity will fix everything. This message is repeated every hour in the radios and TV. What can I make of this? Well, let's do a little thinking. We are now entering year 4 of the pandemic. Like right now is the beginning, the first days of year 4. Has mass immunity fixed anything? No. What it has done is it has created many new variants that are much more serious. It has killed millions of people. It has disabled tens of millions more. And there is as much COVID now as ever before and then some. And the strains that we have are more contagious and they are more immune evasive. And I don't know what else anyone needs to know. Yeah, and just on the N95s, N95s have a set amount of hours, I think like 12 hours that they're rated for, and then you got to use a different one. So one of the advantages of the P100s is they have cartridges that have the filters. The cartridges just attach to the like rubber part of the mask. And so they're not disposable. You don't have to be changing them like every other day, and so on. But yeah, you don't want to overuse an N95 past its rating. The elastomeric is a big mask with straps and everything. The one I got looks like a white dome with a thick lining around the mouth and nose. Oh yeah, so they make like paper P100s, are not paper, but you know what I'm saying. The elastomeric is one of those like gas mask looking things, but again, that's sort of the gold standard. They just work the best. Is there a good P100 we can buy? So a lot of people like the Evusheld, I think. No, am I? That might be completely no. That's a. Sorry, I'm getting. What is the thing? That's a monoclonal antibody. What is the name of that thing? It's something. Here, let's see. Merrick. All right, so if you just search on elastomeric, Elastomeric, P100, the GVS Ellipse. So this comes out of the UK, and a lot of people wear those. There's also in the US Dentec. Those you can get for like between 30 and $50, and they're NIOSH certified, so that's the US standard. There's also 3M. They make a lot of the N95 masks. They also make P100s. So I think GVS and Dentec, Dentec, and N9 and 3M. Those are like kind of the most common ones. Yeah. All right. You are welcome. So now let us go into a segment. I'm trying to decide. So I was thinking of starting with. I'm going to go right into the immune stuff, and then we'll kind of backtrack tomorrow and do some of the individual versus population health approaches. But I've been dying to do immune stuff for months now, but the material that I had previously I felt was too technical. There's a guy, Jeff Gilchrist, on Twitter, who I recommend that you follow. He's going to come up in this thread. And he did, back over the summer in June or July, he did T-Cell Week. Basically like the Discovery Channel has Shark Week, they have T-Cell Week. And I thought it was good, but I thought it was like pretty technical to get into all the studies. I started recording something on that, and I decided not to do it after all. But I've been wanting to do this for a while, so let's just not hold back. I'm going to get right into this today. What did I save this as? Immune. Okay. Here we go. Where's my thing? All right, so this is from The Record in Canada. Story by Terry Pender, December 20. Headline, Immune Systems Seriously Weakened by COVID. Evolving research says that COVID leaves many people at heightened risk for other infections. Oh, okay. Well, could that be, the reason why we're seeing such a horrible flu season and RSV and stuff like that? Waterloo region. Emergency wards remain busy 2 years after the first COVID-19 vaccines arrived in Ontario, in part because the virus depletes the body's supply of T cells, leaving young and old alike vulnerable to secondary infections, says a University of Waterloo immunologist. T cells are the frontline soldiers of the immune system. So it's basically like your B cells and your T cells are like the two big things in your immune system there. And the number of T cells typically increases when the body is fighting off an infection, said Barb Katzenbach, who studies viruses. Quote, individuals who are infected with COVID have many fewer T cells, said Katzenbach. Quote, that's a problem for us because T cells are a really important part of our immune system that helps us defend against infection. But at least 3 studies, and I would say it's more than that, show that COVID-19 actually kills off a significant number of the body's T cells. So even when someone recovers from COVID, they're at a heightened risk for other viral, bacterial, and fungal infections. Quote, that is causing a lot of people to go to the emergency rooms, rightly so, to seek medical aid, and it's overwhelming our healthcare system, Katzenbach said. The only other virus that attacks and kills T cells is HIV, which causes AIDS, said Katzenbach. And like I said, there are other viruses that can turn T cells cancerous, but as far as just straight up murdering them, that would be COVID and HIV, or SARS coronavirus 2 and HIV. To be clear, nobody's equating COVID's impact on T cells to what HIV did to immune systems before effective retroviral treatments were developed. But COVID-19 does eliminate a significant number of T cells, enough to make large numbers of sick people overwhelm emergency wards with RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus, pneumonia, strep infections, and other ailments. In other words, illnesses that normally, can land a few people in the hospital, but you can usually recover from at home. Now they're causing much more damage to the people because your immune system just can't fight them off because your immune system's worn out from COVID. Quote, with the loss of these T cells, we are now more vulnerable to all of these other infections, other viruses, other bacteria, said Katzenbach. They are getting in and causing disease, and often more severe disease than what we might have seen previously, said Katzenbach. She said that COVID-19 sparks what's called programmed cell death among T cells, or apoptosis. Cells in the human body do this naturally as they age, but COVID-19 causes healthy T cells to die that would otherwise be available to fight off infections. Quote, the fallout from all this is more secondary infections, more extreme infections and mortality, or people dying because of these infections. Waterloo region hit a grim milestone last week with its 500th COVID death. Many people who have COVID brush it off, saying it was no worse than a bad case of the flu. What they don't know is that they are more vulnerable to secondary infections that may cause them to seek help at a hospital emergency ward. Vaccines work, she said, but COVID mutates rapidly. Quote, so it's important to be up to date with your vaccines, said Katzenbach, and wear a good quality N95 mask to protect yourself and your loved ones. So there you go, Terry Pender, thank you for covering that. A ray of sanity in an overall severely lacking sea of COVID coverage. So there you have it. And let me add that T cells also help fight things like cancer. If you have cells turning cancerous and your immune system detects that, then your T cells can step in and help fight it off. If you don't have those T cells available, that cancer may actually turn into a bigger problem and it may not get stopped by your immune system, and so on. So this is not just a problem with for increased risk of infectious disease, but other kinds of damage and problems going on in the body. All right, a few other things on the immune system topic while we're talking about it. Here is a tweet, and again, this is our year-end wrap-up. We'll be honoring a few people who have stuck to treating COVID seriously. So this is Laura Miers at Laura Miers, Miers. And this is a thread she has going on fungal infections with COVID. And it's just a thread of cases from throughout the year of unusual stuff happening. It's kind of like we had never seen an outbreak of monkeypox beyond like a couple hundred cases in the US. Like normally it's single digits or double digits. One time it was triple digits. And then suddenly we get 30,000 cases in 1 year. Is that a coincidence, or is it COVID-induced immune dysfunction? So likewise with this. So Candida auris. This is back in April. 15 cases of Candida auris have been detected in Michigan. And there's another outbreak in Italy. Anyway, you can go into that thread if you search on any of these phrases and look at sort of that ongoing thing. Now, I mentioned Jeff Gilchrist earlier. We are actually going to look at some of that Shark Week thing, but we're not going to dive into the studies as I wanted to do. So this is some of what he was posting. Children dying from strep throat and other immune consequences. This virus season, this is a current thread, has been like no other, with high hospitalization rates from RSV, influenza, and now more children are dying from strep A bacterial infections. This long thread looks at what might be going on. And let me just add, the year that I had long COVID, I was having symptoms basically between December 2020 and about November 2021. So it's been over for about 13 months so far. That summer, I got like 6 months, it's smack in the middle of it. I got the worst sinus infection I've ever had in my life. I had to take 2 rounds of antibiotics to kill it. I don't think that that's a coincidence. So anyway, so far in the UK, this is a few weeks ago, December 5th, 5 children have died in England under age 10 within a week of diagnosis of invasive group strep A, a bacterial infection, and 1 7-year-old child in Wales. The rates of invasive strep A in children age 1 through 4 is 4.6 times higher, and age 5 through 9 is 3.7 times higher than pre-pandemic 2017 to 2019 seasons, according to the UK HSA. A 9-year-old Canadian girl also recently died from a bacterial infection. Normally, most infections cause mild illnesses, but this bacteria can also cause scarlet fever, and in rare occasions, it can infect the lungs and bloodstream, which needs urgent treatment and can be life-threatening. The bacteria can easily spread between people. This kind of infection is typically treated successfully with antibiotics, but currently many places, including Canada, are facing antibiotic shortages, so the necessary treatment may not be easily available. The UK HSA is advising people to call 911, 999, or go to emergency if your child is having difficulty breathing. There are pauses when your child breathes. Your child's skin, tongue, or lips are blue, sign of extreme oxygen deficiency. Your child is floppy and will not wake up or stay awake. Why are serious strep A bacterial infections worse this year than before the pandemic? Dr. David Fisman points out that surges in viral respiratory infections can lead to downstream surges in invasive bacterial disease. So there's a quote tweet there. Surges in viral respiratory infections can absolutely result in downstream surges in invasive bacterial disease. Our group has demonstrated this for both pneumococcal and meningococcal disease downstream from influenza, and downstream from RSV. His group has demonstrated this with, that's summarizing that, influenza and pneumococcal disease, and also a 4.3 times increased risk after RSV and 2 times increased risk after influenza activity for meningococcal disease. It isn't just bacterial infections that are on the rise, but fungal infections as well, where in India more than 4,300 COVID patients died after fungal infection, retweeting an earlier thing there. So we're seeing these infections that maybe we wouldn't have seen in the past, but something's different with the way that people's bodies are responding to these bacterial, fungal, etc. infections. The WHO warned in October that the risk of fungal infections on humans is skyrocketing, especially from one called Candida albicans, which is yeast that is responsible for infections like thrush and vaginal yeast infections. So they show the fungal priority pathogens there. And let me just add, if you're familiar with sort of like the natural health world or anything, there's a lot of people who try to claim that Candida is like basically the root of all evil, which is mostly overblown. If you have any kind of a functioning immune system, Candida albicans is not usually like a huge problem. Other than like little local infections, you're not going to get like systemic Candida. However, in this case, there is increased risk that your body may not be able to fight off that local infection quite as well. It could spread and actually end up compromising your health. Can viral infection also impact your ability to fight off Candida fungus? It turns out that COVID-19 impairs the immune response to Candida albicans, including showing signs of T-cell exhaustion. So another researcher, guy's name is, it's an Italian name, escaping me right now, but he basically said COVID-19, it like makes your immune system run a marathon that it can't stop running, and the T cells just get completely exhausted and cannot react normally to other things. Viruses have been found to have detrimental effects on the immune system before. Quote, widespread vaccination against measles can protect communities from a wide array of other viruses and bacteria by preventing immune amnesia, an unusual measles side effect that scientists now think drives epidemics of other illnesses. So in other words, you get measles and then you're more prone to getting other things. Measles has the nasty ability to alter the immune system itself, to forget every single pathogen it has ever encountered, your immune memory, like rebooting your system as if you had never been exposed to a microbe or infection before. So measles can get in there and basically like wipe your hard drive, and suddenly you have to re-encounter all these things, every pathogen you've ever encountered. So there's precedent for this. Most people who die from measles actually do so because of secondary infections. The virus binds to your immune memory cells and eliminates them, destroying B cells and reducing the diversity of nonspecific B cells. Another outbreak called tomato flu, we covered this last week, with over 80 cases, mostly children under age 5, has been spreading in India, and it causes high temperature, intense joint pain, and rash, where painful blisters can grow to the size of a tomato. Now, they found out this is, as we're about to reveal, is actually Coxsackie A16. It's the same virus that causes hand, foot, and mouth disease. But it looked like a new disease because people's immune systems were treating it so differently. Turns out it's not a new disease at all, but the virus is now impacting children very differently than it used to. Scientists and doctors have noted that viruses have been doing strange things since the COVID pandemic started, such as typically winter seasonal viruses spreading in the summer, and a mysterious outbreak of hepatitis in children in 2021. We're going to cover that in the children's section on a subsequent day. Public Health Ontario, PHO, this past summer warned that COVID-19 infection can cause immune dysregulation. Quote, a potential increase in acquired impaired immunity. So impaired immunity that you acquired at some point in the Ontario population. could have significant impact on the incidence, that's like the number of cases, and associated burden of infectious diseases, e.g. high viral loads, increased antibiotic use and resistance, and other conditions in the longer term. So again, we'll be covering more of the impact on kids in its own section on a later day. Besides potential immune dysregulation, COVID-19 infections have been found to cause damage to the lungs in children even with mild infections more than a year after infection. So that's persistent lung dysfunction even in mild acute cases in kids. Even the recovered kids still have measurable lung damage, and only one child in the study group had been vaccinated. So it's not the vaccine causing this issue. It would not be surprising that children previously infected with COVID that still have lung damage may be at higher risk for severe disease from other respiratory infections. If immune dysregulation is also happening, the risk could be even higher. What are we seeing so far? Pediatric hospitals all over North America and many other parts of the world are currently overwhelmed with severe cases of RSV and influenza. The Children's Hospital in Canada's capital has recently had to request help from the Canadian Red Cross to support patient care, where the ER recently saw 218 children with 11 waiting for a bed and critical care units operating at 130% capacity. Not just hospitals, but ambulance services are also frequently running at level 0 when no ambulances are available to respond. This tragically happened in Ottawa during October, where a 911 call was made from an elementary school about an 11-year-old girl with no vital signs during a level 0 who was unfortunately later pronounced dead after being transported to the Children's Hospital. This is the new normal of living with infectious disease and not having measures in place to reduce the risk of infection during respiratory season when community transmission is high. From January 2022 to September 23rd, there were almost 1,300 level 0 events in Ottawa, and paramedics spent 52,000 hours waiting to offload patients to hospitals that didn't have enough beds. So that's another thing that is slowing down the EMTs and ambulances, is they have a patient in the back of their thing and they can't put them in the hospital because there's no room in the hospital. And so that ambulance can't go back out to respond to another call. The latest Canadian Flu Watch, and this graphic to me is chilling, the latest Canadian Flu Watch data shows pediatric hospitalizations just for influenza are skyrocketing, and many times higher than the average number of hospitalizations from the 2014-2015 through 2019-2020 flu seasons before the pandemic. All right, so let's look at that graphic before moving on. So the gray area there is and you can see the black dotted line within it. That is the average number of hospitalizations for the 2014-2015 through the 2019-2020 flu seasons. So those winters starting 2014, ending 2015, all the way up to right before the pandemic. That was your average range. So that's what you would typically expect to see these days. Then the number of hospitalizations last winter. Now the dark blue is the dotted blue line. So lower and later. Why? People are masking, people are taking precautions, etc. Now this year, when we're letting it rip, this extends way beyond COVID. Okay, it starts right about at the usual time, but compared to that gray, like average zone, the gray zone, if you will, it's starting at around the same time, like week 42, but it's going through the roof right off the bat. So it's already, at like 150% of the peak of that average. And it is many, many weeks ahead of where that peak usually occurs. So this is where we're at. That is courtesy of Canadian Flu Watch. All right. Also, wastewater tracking in Ottawa, Canada shows influenza A levels are still increasing and RSV levels are still high. So there's the graph. And then there's an anecdote below. My friend's 8-year-old passed away on Thanksgiving from a cough that turned to cardiac arrest, to coma, intubation, and the body not reacting to medicine in the span of 3 days. So That is what we're dealing with in the current scenario. Do you see people reporting on this? Because I sure as fuck don't. All right. Now, let's continue with Gilchrist. I did want to at least give an overview. This is worth mentioning as we do our year-end, the T-cell week wrap-up. So COVID-19, T-cell dysfunction, impaired development, and infected monocytes. The Discovery Channel has Shark Week. For me, this is T-cell week. Today, we're exploring several studies looking at T-cell dysfunction, thymic atrophy, impaired T-cell development, and infected monocytes. Whoops, wrong thing. Let's try that one again. All right. A study looking at patients who suffer from chronic neurological symptoms after COVID-19 infection, otherwise known as neurological long COVID, found a specific immunological signature compared to people who had recovered from COVID-19 and are now healthy. They also found a significant elevation in nucleocapsid-specific antibody and T-cell responses. So what's nucleocapsid-specific antibody? So the virus has spikes on it, and that would be the spike proteins, and you can get antibodies for those. The nucleocapsid is like the wrapper, the sort of soccer ball at the middle of the virus that contains the genetic material. That's the nucleocapsid. It is the capsule, if you will, that surrounds the nucleus of the virus. So anyway, you can also make antibodies that are specific to the nucleocapsid or N. While the spike protein in COVID-19 is the most well-known, nucleocapsid is another protein and the one that rapid antigen tests, or RAT tests, are based on. Neurological long COVID patients had higher IFN gamma T cells against all N and membrane or M proteins. Try to say M and membrane at the same time. While healthy COVID convalescents, in other words, people who had COVID but recovered, didn't get long COVID, displayed specificity for different regions of the N protein and lower responses, again, to the M protein. So again, we're not even getting into the full study. That's still a little bit technical. Let's break this down. So neuro-long COVID patients. So IFN gamma, this is interferon, part of your immune response. They had higher of that kind of T cells against all nucleocapsid and viral membrane proteins. So they were fighting that, while the healthy people who had COVID but recovered fully, didn't get long COVID, they displayed a specificity in their immune response for different regions of the nucleocapsid protein and lower responses against the membrane protein. So their immune systems have a different signature. Their immune systems are doing different things, but it's a pattern across many of the patients. Continuing, this indicates a different hierarchy of immunodominance between groups. No significant differences were found in IL-2 production. The HC group in the graph are healthy controls which tested negative for COVID-19 antibodies. So they never had COVID at all. Importantly, hospitalization prior to the development of neuro-long COVID did not impact the magnitude of the immune IFN gamma responses to viral proteins. Quote, overall, our study demonstrates that the neuro-long COVID patients, PASC is post-acute sequelae of COVID, or in other words, long COVID, have elevated IFN gamma responses to internal protein of SARS coronavirus 2, the nucleocapsid and membrane proteins, enhanced activation of TFH cells linked to increased anti-nucleocapsid antibody production, but impaired CD8 plus T cell memory compared with healthy COVID convalescents. There were also correlations between the severity of cognitive deficits or quality of life impairments and increased cytolytic granule production. So cytolytic granules, these are things that can break down cells. Lysis is splitting. So you're getting different immunological profiles between people who recover from this and people who don't. So people who develop cognitive deficits or quality of life impairments, they're having correlations between their CD8 plus T cells and things like that. Like I said, this is more technical. We'll be moving through it. The first author of the study developed long COVID, and since her own research suggests that the T cell dysfunction they found might suggest a persistent infection. So in other words, there's a lot of different hypotheses, or there's at least a half a dozen or so hypotheses as to what is mainly driving long COVID. Persistent infection is one of them. Like, for example, in a Boston study we covered a few months ago, they were able to detect COVID spike protein in 60% of the long COVID patients. So it wasn't all of them, but it was a lot of them. So there could be more than one thing happening. Autoimmunity is another thing. It's where this infection triggers your immune system to start attacking your own body. That would be the auto part. Auto is self. So autoimmunity is when your immune system attacks your own tissue as if it were foreign and needs to be, attacked and gotten rid of. That a COVID infection can be triggering that to happen. So there may be different things, but the persistent infection seems to be pretty well supported in at least many cases. Let's see. She decided to take a COVID-19 antiviral to see if it would help. So I've mentioned before the anecdotal case of somebody. Oh, I should go back to that actually. The anecdotal case of a researcher having long COVID and trying Paxlovid. So that's at GEMALE10, at Gamale10. And if you want to read that, it's from April 5th, about their experience of taking Paxlovid for their long COVID with mixed results, but it did seem to give some relief. Now, whether that's because it was due to persistent infection or whether that was due to anti-inflammatory effects of Paxlovid, still unclear. But we still don't have treatments for long COVID. So whether an antiviral might help needs to be investigated. Anyway, there's a link to that there. Another study that shows that COVID-19 actually infects immune cells. These monocytes and macrophages are sentinel cells that sense pathogens that activate processes leading to inflammatory death and the release of potent inflammatory mediators. So, in other words, these cells, they are sentinels. They travel around the body trying to sense pathogens that can activate lethal inflammation within your body. So it's called pyropoptosis, I believe. So pyro meaning fire, and then the apoptosis is the cell death. So yeah, I mean, inflammation is not your friend in your body. It causes cell damage and aging and all that kind of stuff. So, having a diet rich in anti-inflammatory and antioxidant and all those kinds of things is good for you. It slows down these processes. So part of your immune system looks out for this stuff. And what happened? Researchers found that about 6% of blood monocytes of patients with COVID-19 are infected with the COVID-19 virus. So it's not just that the infection is making your immune system overwork. It is actually infecting it itself and killing it. They checked to see if antibodies elicited by mRNA vaccination helped facilitate monocyte infection, but found that post-vaccination plasma did not facilitate virus uptake or replication. So they thought that maybe the mRNA vaccination was facilitating the immune cells to get infected. They found it was not. Interestingly, they found that COVID-19 virus begins to replicate in monocytes, but then infected cells undergo pyropoptosis, that's what I was talking about, inflammatory cell death, that aborts the production of infectious virus but causes systemic inflammation that contributes to COVID-19 disease. So let's break that down. They found that the virus replicates in your monocytes, but then the infected cells undergo inflammatory cell death. This stops the virus, but the inflammation can cause some of the symptoms that people experience. The final study for today finds some COVID-19 variants induce thymic atrophy and impaired T cell development. The thymus is a small gland in the body. It's basically above your heart, like at the top of your rib cage, basically. It makes and trains immune T cells. So Pretty much your bone marrow creates them, and then they get activated in the thymus. Performing studies with humanized ACE2 receptor in the thymus of mice, they found COVID-19 virus infects thymocytes, depletes CD4 and CD8 plus T cells, which are associated with an increased apoptosis of thymocytes. That's that cell death again, which leads to severe thymic atrophy in mice. So let's read that again. They performed studies with the ACE2 receptor in the thymus of mice. So basically, ACE2 is the receptor that COVID binds to. It's how it gains access to your cells. ACE2 is a chemical in your body that many of your cells respond to, especially major organs like your brain, lungs, liver, kidneys, heart, etc. And so that's why COVID can infect them so much, is they have a lot of ACE2 receptors. So in the mice that had humanized ACE2 receptors, the virus infected the thymocytes, depletes the T cells, and led to thymic atrophy. Atrophy is like shrinking and weakening. They also found certain T cells to be enriched in infected thymus, indicating an early arrest in the T cell developmental pathway. Importantly, they determined interferon gamma, IFNY, was crucial for thymic atrophy, as anti-IFN gamma antibody neutralization rescued the loss of thymic involution. In mice, therapeutic use of antivirals such as remdesivir was also able to rescue thymic atrophy. So if you remember, remdesivir was one, before Paxlovid, it was like one of the first things that was talked about as a treatment for COVID back in 2020. So they tried this, and they found that they were able to save the thymus from being completely atrophied by the virus. Researchers found that the Omicron variant, likely BA1 based on the timing of the publication, caused the marginal thymic atrophy, while the Delta variant exhibited a more profound impact and severely depleted T cells. So newer Omicron variants such as BA5 have some of the same mutations as Delta, so it would be interesting to see how it compares. So what he's saying there is that the Delta variant last fall had more severe effects, causing the thymus to atrophy and deplete T cells because, again, the T cells need the thymus to get activated. And the Delta variant was severely impairing that process. Omicron did so less, although it still would do it. But the new Omicron variants have some of the Delta mutations. So it has some of those characteristics. We're still unclear on how the effects of the BA5 Omicron that has some of those Delta characteristics. We don't know if it has these Delta characteristics. So that will have to be studied, and I guess we will see in time. We're not sure. We know that Omicron impaired the thymus and T cell production less than Delta did, although it does impair it. But now maybe these later Omicrons that have some of the Delta characteristics could be impairing it more severely. More research is needed. Anyway, if you can see T Cell Tuesday there. He did a whole week of this stuff. I read it. Like I said, I found it was like a little technical to do here on the channel. But if you want to follow up with that, I highly recommend following that guy. He usually has good posts. All right, last thing that we're going to do today is another thing along the same lines. We're going to check in with William Haseltine, writer for Forbes, who knows what the fuck he's talking about and writes good articles on COVID. We've covered a lot of his articles. SARS coronavirus 2 actively infects and kills lymphoid cells. This is back from April. So again, this stuff has been known for a while. And I have so many articles in the folder, it takes longer to scroll down to the right one. All right. Much of the public discussion surrounding SARS coronavirus 2 infection has focused on the interactions between the SARS coronavirus 2 spike protein and cellular ACE2 receptors. Again, that's what we were just talking about. Now, researchers at the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences have found this may only be part of the story. In a recent paper published by the journal Nature, scientists describe a new target for the SARS coronavirus that is independent of ACE2 receptors, our T cells. So your T cells don't have those receptors, but they can still get infected by SARS coronavirus 2. One of the critical symptoms of SARS coronavirus 2 infection is lymphopenia. So penia means deficiency. Lymphopenia is a condition in which patients exhibit reduced levels of white blood cells called lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are the fundamental defense cells of our adaptive immune system. They consist of natural killer cells, or NK cells, T cells, and B cells. When any of these cells are reduced, it can inhibit our body's ability to protect itself from viruses. Recent reports have shown that marked lymphopenia is observed in 83.2% of SARS coronavirus 2 patients. So that is the overwhelming majority. To put it in another way, only 17% of SARS coronavirus 2 patients do not show marked lymphopenia. All right? So if you get COVID, odds are 5 out of 6 that you have lymphopenia. But little is known about how SARS coronavirus 2 effectively dismantles one of our primary tools of defense. Shen et al. Explored this question by first determining which lymphocytes SARS coronavirus 2 targeted. Researchers collected blood cell samples from 22 patients with severe SARS coronavirus 2 and from 15 healthy donors. They then tested each sample for 3 major lymphocyte cell types to determine any differences in lymphocyte counts between the healthy and the infected donors. To their surprise, patients with severe SARS coronavirus 2 exhibited a significant decline in T cells only. This suggested that SARS coronavirus 2 induced lymphopenia is due to a decline in T cells, and that T cells are the primary lymphocyte targets of the SARS coronavirus 2 virus. So cyte means cell, so lymphocyte, lymph cell. How does SARS coronavirus 2 attack T cells? Shen et al. Hypothesized that the virus might directly infect T cells, killing them in the process. To test this theory, they analyzed the T lymphocytes of infected patients for the presence of viral antigens. This analysis confirmed that SARS coronavirus 2 antigens were present inside the T lymphocytes, and that the virus could directly infect T cells. So an antigen is basically a foreign protein. It's like something invading your body that your immune system is going to be reacting to. And so they're finding the viral particles inside the T lymphocytes, which confirms that the virus could directly infect them. To confirm this, the group examined lung sections from patients who had suffered fatal SARS coronavirus 2 infections. They found that the lung tissue contained high levels of T lymphocytes, and that many T lymphocytes tested positive for SARS coronavirus 2 proteins, indicating the infection of those T cells. And that's shown there in figure 1. So you can see patients with fatal SARS coronavirus 2 infections displayed substantial levels of T lymphocytes. And arrows are pointing there. All right, on to screen 4. These results were further corroborated by in vitro experiments. Shen et al. Infected 3 model T cell types with SARS coronavirus 2, Gilchrist cells, MT4 cells, and T cells isolated from healthy donors. So they took a bunch of different types of T cells and infected them to see what was happening. After initial infection, Shen et al. Tested the cells for viral subgenomic mRNA. Subgenomic mRNA is an ideal marker for SARS coronavirus 2 because it's only produced in infected cells during viral replication. If the researchers found that in the cells, it would indicate that the cells were actively infected and that the virus was replicating. So in other words, they're going to put some virus with these cells in order to try to infect them. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's really effectively causing the virus to replicate. However, this showed that the cells contained a marker that showed it had created new virus as part of this process. So it was using those cells to replicate. Remember, viruses are not really alive. Some people consider them alive, some people don't, but they don't really meet all the criteria of life. And I tend to favor that definition, that viruses are not truly alive. They need other cells in order to replicate. And so they do not on their own carry out all the typical characteristics of living organisms. So they need to find another cell, and then they squirt in their genetic material, RNA or DNA, and then they get that cell to replicate to make copies of itself. So they trick some other cell into copying them. After the experiment, not only did Shen et al. Find substantial levels of subgenomic mRNA in the infected cells, but subgenomic mRNA levels grew significantly after 24 hours. These results were consistent across all 3 cell types. Next, the researchers investigated whether SARS coronavirus 2 infection could induce T-cell death. To do so, Shen et al. Analyzed infected cells for markers of apoptosis. Apoptosis is a natural consequence of infection, and it occurs when an infected cell self-destructs to prevent a virus from replicating and spreading to other healthy cells. So we talked about apoptosis before. It's programmed cell death. When would you want that? Well, a case like this, where a cell will self-destruct rather than serving as a replication center for a virus. Another time you want apoptosis is cancer cells. Cancer cells is unchecked growth, basically. Apoptosis is not happening as it should. You want to try to induce apoptosis in cancer cells. Okay. Surprisingly, T lymphocytes from SARS coronavirus 2 patients displayed nearly 10 times the number of apoptotic cells than healthy individuals. So there's a major war going on in the T lymphocytes of infected people. In many of the patients, the apoptotic cells also contained viral antigens, further indicating that apoptosis was a direct consequence of SARS coronavirus 2 infection, and in other words, not caused by something else. It happened during this battle with the virus getting inside of it. It is common knowledge that SARS coronavirus 2 primarily infects cells by interacting with ACE2 receptors expressed on the cell membrane. However, lymphocytes are known to contain very few, if any, ACE2 receptors. How then could SARS coronavirus 2 have such a profound effect on T cells? In other words, ACE2 receptors is how we normally know SARS coronavirus 2 to be able to get into a cell. Well, this doesn't have it. So how did it get in? They conducted an experiment using model T cells, Gilchrist cells, and non-lymphocyte cells, CACO2 cells, as control cells. To test whether SARS coronavirus 2 infected the T cells through ACE2 receptors, the researchers inactivated the genes responsible for producing ACE2 receptors in both the Gilchrist and CACO2 cells. So in other words, these cells were not going to produce or express any ACE2 receptors because they had the genes turned off. So that would rule that out. They then exposed both cell types to SARS coronavirus 2. Surprisingly, a lack of ACE2 receptors decreased SARS coronavirus 2 infection in the CACO2 control cells, but had no effect on infection in the Gilchrist cells. This finding demonstrated that SARS coronavirus 2 infection of T cells occurs independently from the ACE2 receptors. So in the 2 different types of cells, they took out the ACE2 receptors, and it did decrease the infection of the one kind of cell, but it had no effect on the Gilchrist cells. So clearly it's infecting those Gilchrist cells some other way. Motivated by this finding, the researchers sought to discover which T cell receptors were involved in SARS coronavirus 2 infection. 2 of the most common receptors found on T cell membranes are AXL and LFA1. These 2 receptors are also highly expressed in the model Gilchrist cells. Once again, the researchers inactivated the genes for these receptors in Gilchrist cells. They then infected Gilchrist cells with SARS coronavirus 2. After running the experiment for 24 hours, they found that an absence of AXL receptors did not block infection. However, when AXL was overexpressed on the membrane, it seemed to increase the infection. So in other words, when there were no AXL receptors, it could still get infected, but when it was overexpressed, it increased the infection. So it seemed to be using it, but it wasn't dependent on that, because even when there weren't any, it was still getting in somehow. An absence of LFA1 receptors significantly decreased viral infection. When LFA1 was overexpressed, it also promoted or increased the SARS coronavirus 2 infection. This indicated that while AXL may play a small role in SARS coronavirus 2 infection of T cells, LFA1 is a far more convincing candidate as far as being the main thing. Like, it can use the other one, But as far as the main candidate, it's probably ALFA1. And that may be the key to developing medications that limit SARS coronavirus 2 induced lymphopenia. Well, that would be if there was even the slightest motivation to do any of this stuff. I mean, this is currently just... Have you heard anyone in the media talking about anything like this? No. So then are people seeking treatment for it? No. Even when people do go and self-advocate for long COVID treatment, a lot of times they're getting gaslit by their providers. So, like, who is going to come up with drugs for this? I mean, anyway, we're just so far behind. Currently, there are several theories surrounding SARS coronavirus 2 induced lymphopenia and how the virus can attack lymphocytes in the absence of ACE2 receptors. However, this paper represents real progress in our understanding of the scope of SARS coronavirus 2 infections and provides an interesting theory about how SARS coronavirus 2 induced lymphopenia occurs. As research continues to develop, it will be interesting to discover exactly how this virus attacks and dismantles one of our key defense systems. Again, the T lymphocytes. So, it's not using ACE2 receptors. It is probably mostly using LFA1 receptors on the T cells, as well as the AXL to a lesser extent. And we've seen that, the ACE2 receptor is the biggest thing that that's the biggest lock that the key of the spike protein fits into. But we've covered other stories where the spike protein can also directly interact with the immune system, not to gain access to cells and infect them, but to initiate inflammatory processes. So inflammation in certain amounts is part of your normal immune response. There are healthy uses of inflammation in the course of an infection or other immune response. But over, large amounts of inflammation, as said, are damaging to tissue and can cause aging and et cetera. Well, the spike protein can go up to some of your immune cells and basically go, hey, go do some inflammation. And they've got the key that fits in that lock. So they can directly not just induce inflammation because they're infecting your body, but they can jimmy your immune system to start pro-inflammatory processes on their own. So anyway. All right, let's catch up with the chat, and then we're going to end for today. We'll be back tomorrow. So, some notes on N95. Somebody says, N95, 40 total hours usually. Check your mask to see what it says, what it's rated for. P100s, usually 6 months unless you're in a wildfire area before you got to change the filters. And again, the P100, you just change the filter in the canister. If you check out Homozygote's stream, he has people on, I don't know who that person is. He has people on from all over, like Europe, Latin America, etc., and they often know where to get tested and such. I got vaccination from Mexico from his chat. Okay. And that is HOMOZYGOAT. Again, I'm unfamiliar and can't vouch for that, but regular in the chat said that. I'm in Puerto Rico finishing my visit with my parents, then going back to Florida to my grandma on my mom's side. I live with her. Yeah, the amount of buildings that have been destroyed by hurricanes Fiona, Maria, and the earthquake have gotten rid of my favorite hangout spots. But on a COVID note, there are still tons of anti-vax people in Puerto Rico. Some have literal vaccine stations with light-up signs because of misinfo. So keep Puerto Rico in your thoughts and prayers. I know Western leftists don't really care, I feel. It's often not on my radar. We've tried to cover Puerto Rico from time to time. But yeah, definitely. It is unfortunate how loud the misinformation and disinformation sources are. And we definitely try to counter that. I'm glad I've been masking and kept visits brief and small. Everyone I know seems to be getting COVID. Yup, my wife's cousin recently went to a holiday gathering where she knew someone would have COVID. People are fucking stupid. Yep, don't do that. Large amounts of inflammation causes so many diseases long term. S4A, you explain medical data better than most university professors. Well, Explaining things in terms people can actually understand is important, and it's just a priority. You just got to put the energy into it. You just got to approach it and say, well, you need some imagination too. You just got to say, like, well, if I knew nothing about this, how would I begin understanding it today? And a lot of people, a lot of times people have studied for a long time and they talk over people's heads. That really does no one any benefit. It's just you hearing yourself talk. And so maybe your ego benefits, but you're not really going to educate people that way. And that's important because, a lot of people do not read or really understand that well. I mean, the average level of literacy in the U.S. is fairly low. If you really want large amounts of people to understand something, it really does help to break it down in simple terms, and that's just the way it is. I mean, people get specialized in different things. They don't necessarily get specialized in biology, yet we are biology. You know what I mean? We're walking, living, collections of cells, highly organized collections of cells. And yeah, it pays to know how your own body works so that you can maximize your health and get potential out of your life. SARS coronavirus 2 running rampant definitely stacks the odds against that. And again, this whole year-end COVID wrap-up and catch-up is designed to help do just that. I want to thank everybody in the chat today for showing up. I definitely went longer than I was planning, partly because I forgot about doing that anti-fascist close up from before, and we did like a half an hour on that. But I appreciate everybody in the chat. We had like 40, 50 people here. Always good to see. You help to contribute content to this channel with your questions and informed commentary, and I really appreciate that. Thanks also to the many people I follow and who follow back and share resources, some of which make it into streams like this. I see some of these stories because of you, so I appreciate that, and we will continue to acknowledge more of that as we go through the rest of our year-end COVID wrap-up. Expect some additional content on the channel as well between now and the end of the year. And then I'm probably going to take the first week or two off in January. I need a little bit of a break. We will get a lot of content up, though. All right, thanks again, and we will see you next time.